The Light of the Spear, The Journey of Longinus, From Warrior to Saint. Chapter 1. The Roman Soldier and His Restless Heart. In the early years of the 1st century, in the rugged region of Cappadocia, what we now know as central Turkey, a boy named Longinus was born into a devout pagan family with a proud military lineage. From the moment he could walk, he was trained in the arts of war: how to wield a sword, how to ride a horse into battle, how to suppress fear and silence compassion. In the Roman world, strength and obedience were the highest virtues, and young Longinus embodied them both. As he grew into manhood, his prowess in combat and his unwavering loyalty to the empire propelled him swiftly through the military ranks. By the time he was in his late 20s, he held the respected title of centurion, commander of 100 Roman soldiers. His armor gleamed in the Mediterranean sun, his presence carried authority, and his decisions meant life or death. In the eyes of his superiors, he was the ideal soldier, efficient, emotionless, and unshakable. But the surface often hides the truth beneath. Deep inside, behind the cold eyes and disciplined posture, Longinus wrestled with a restlessness he couldn't explain. Victories on the battlefield didn't fill the void. Honors and promotions only added weight to his chest. He followed the rituals of Roman gods, sacrificed at temples, recited the invocations, but none of it brought peace. Something in him remained empty. When he was reassigned to the province of Judea, Longinus didn't complain. It was a volatile land, rife with uprisings and religious tensions, a punishment post in the eyes of most soldiers. But for Longinus, it was just another duty. He followed orders, enforced laws, and most notably, oversaw executions. In Jerusalem, the Roman answer to rebellion was crucifixion, and Longinus became all too familiar with it. He had seen dozens of men die on the cross: thieves, rebels, even some who looked too young to shave. The screaming, the blood, the begging, it had all become noise to him. He could stand under a crucifix and eat his lunch without flinching. The suffering of others no longer pierced him. It was just part of the job. But that unfeeling exterior concealed more than a soldier's discipline. Longinus had begun to suffer from a mysterious affliction. His eyesight was deteriorating. Slowly, day by day, the world became dimmer, blurrier. He consulted Roman physicians, who offered ointments and incantations, but nothing worked. The prospect of going blind, becoming useless to the empire, haunted him. Yet strangely, this growing darkness in his eyes mirrored the ache in his soul. He had climbed the military ladder, executed orders without question, been praised by his superiors, but for what? Was there more to life than conquest and control? It was in the middle of this inner turmoil that fate, or perhaps something greater, placed Longinus at the center of a story that would outlive empires. On a particular morning, like any other in Jerusalem, Longinus received a familiar order: supervise the execution of 3 criminals on Golgotha, the hill outside the city known as the Place of the Skull. Another day, another crucifixion. But what he did not know was that one of those condemned was a man named Jesus of Nazareth. The city was abuzz with whispers about this Jesus. Some called him a prophet, others a fraud. The Jewish leaders accused him of blasphemy. The Romans saw him as a threat to peace. Longinus didn't care. It wasn't his job to pass judgment. His job was to make sure the man died. But the moment Jesus walked past him, carrying his cross, Longinus sensed something different. Unlike the others, who cursed and cried out in anger or despair, Jesus was silent, poised. There was no rage in his eyes, only pain, and strangely, peace. And then came the moment on the cross when Jesus, bloodied and gasping for breath, looked up to the heavens and said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Those words stopped Longinus cold. He had heard all kinds of things from dying men: curses, screams, bargaining, hatred, but never forgiveness, never love. Longinus didn't understand what was happening, but he couldn't look away. As the hours passed, a strange darkness covered the land, as if the sun itself mourned. The sky turned black, the earth trembled, and the air grew heavy. Some said it was an eclipse, others whispered of divine wrath. But to Longinus, it felt like judgment on him, on the empire, on all mankind. Then Jesus cried out, "It is finished," and breathed his last. In that moment, The silence was deafening. The ground shook violently. The veil in the temple was torn. Rocks split apart. Longinus stood still, his heart pounding, as the weight of what he had just witnessed settled in. He stepped closer to the cross. Jesus' lifeless body hung there, unmoving, but not defeated. His face bore no hatred, no fear, only peace. And as Longinus stared up, something broke inside him, some barrier, some armor around his soul. He dropped to his knees. The words rose from his chest like a fire. Truly, this man was the Son of God. It wasn't a theory. It wasn't a guess. It was a certainty so profound, so unshakable, that it changed everything. From that moment on, Longinus could no longer see the world the same way. He couldn't return to being a mere soldier. Something had awakened in him, a vision clearer than anything his failing eyes had ever shown him, a truth that penetrated deeper than any spear could. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing. He had pierced the heart of God, and God, instead of condemning him, had opened his heart and poured out mercy. Chapter 2: The Witness to the Crucifixion. The next morning, before the sun had even climbed above the rooftops of Jerusalem, Longinus sat alone outside the barracks, staring blankly at the stone wall before him. He hadn't slept a moment. The night had been one long, relentless echo of what he'd seen the day before, images flashing before his mind. Like lightning over a stormy sea, the cries from the crowd, the sounds of hammer striking nail, the silence that followed the final breath of the Nazarene. Most haunting of all was the expression on Jesus' face. It wasn't the agony that shook Longinus to his core, it was the peace. The kind of peace that no man could fake, especially not while nailed to a wooden beam and bleeding to death. That peace, that terrifying calm, was what undid him. Longinus was no stranger to death. He had delivered it, witnessed it, lived in its shadow for years. But never like this. Never with the feeling that he, a Roman centurion, had just watched something sacred die. And worse, he had been part of it. When he looked down at his own hands, the same hands that had gripped his spear so many times in battle, they now trembled slightly. The blood that once meant nothing to him, the kind that stained his armor after executions, now seemed heavier, as if he could still feel the warmth of the Nazarene's blood splashing across his soul. He didn't know it yet, but something irreversible had already begun. That day, Jewish authorities approached Governor Pilate again, requesting that the execution be hastened. It was the day of preparation before the Sabbath, and their law forbade leaving bodies exposed on such a holy day. Pilate granted the request, and orders were given to break the legs of the condemned men, an act that would cause rapid asphyxiation by preventing them from pushing up to breathe. Longinus supervised. As always, the two thieves on either side of Jesus were still alive, groaning weakly. With cold efficiency, the soldiers shattered their legs with iron mallets. The sound of bones breaking was sickening, even to hardened ears. But when they approached Jesus, Longinus saw immediately. He was already gone. His body hung still. His chest no longer moved. His face had gone pale, but even in death, that look of peace remained. To confirm the death, and following Roman military protocol, Longinus stepped forward with his spear. With practiced precision, he thrust it into Jesus' right side. And then it happened. A sudden rush of blood and water poured from the wound, an unexpected mixture that splashed across Longinus' face. It stung his eyes at first, and he blinked rapidly. But then something miraculous. The blur that had clouded his vision for months began to lift. The dullness, the darkness, the ache, it vanished. Everything sharpened, colors brightened, and for the first time in a long while, he could see clearly. He staggered back, dazed, his fingers brushing his face. The blood, the water, the clarity, he didn't understand it yet. But that moment was not just a physical healing, it was the beginning of a spiritual awakening. The very eyes that had witnessed so many executions now beheld the truth. He had pierced the Son of God and had been healed by the love flowing from that wound. Word spread quickly among the soldiers. Something strange had happened, but Longinus told no one what he felt. How could he? How could he explain that the man he helped kill had just opened his soul? How could he explain that he was no longer the man they knew? That night, he sat in his quarters, not touching his food. staring at the spear propped in the corner of the room. It had always been a weapon, a tool of power and control. Now it was something else entirely. It was holy. He didn't sleep. He couldn't. Not with his mind playing the scene over and over. The words, the eyes, the moment the earth shook, and the veil of the temple tore in two. The more he tried to dismiss it as coincidence or superstition, the deeper he sank into the truth. And then came the rumors. Jesus' tomb was found empty. The guards who had been stationed to watch it claimed something unimaginable. An angel appeared. The stone was rolled away, and Jesus, dead just days ago, was gone. Longinus didn't scoff. He knew those guards. He trusted their training, their loyalty, their sobriety, and more importantly, he knew what he had seen. He had seen Jesus die. He had also seen blood that healed him. Now the tomb was empty, and nothing in the world made sense anymore. In the days that followed, Longinus withdrew from his post. Officially, he was still a centurion, but his heart was no longer in Rome's service. He found himself wandering the outskirts of the city, drawn to the places where Jesus had walked. He began seeking out the disciples, the women who had followed the teacher, and even Mary, the mother of Jesus. At first, they were afraid of him. Who could blame them? He was the man who had overseen the crucifixion, the very symbol of Roman violence. But when Longinus knelt before them, lowered his head, and said, "I saw him. I pierced his side, and he healed me," the room fell silent. They believed him. One of them, a fisherman named Peter, looked into his eyes and saw not a soldier, but a man broken open by grace. "You have seen," Peter said, and believed. That is a gift, and it was there, in a simple room lit by oil lamps and full of trembling hearts, that Longinus, once a killer, was baptized. The man who had raised a spear now lowered his head beneath the water. It wasn't just symbolic, it was transformation. He died to the empire that had trained him, and he rose, reborn, into the kingdom of God. Longinus was no longer a centurion. He was now a witness. Chapter 3, the Spear of Mercy. The nights in Jerusalem had grown colder since that strange crucifixion day on Golgotha, but Longinus hardly noticed. He wandered the hills alone, not as a soldier seeking control or conquest, but as a man who had lost himself and unexpectedly found something far greater. The spear that had once been an extension of his strength now lay wrapped in linen. Beside his modest bedroll, he hadn't touched it in days, not out of shame but reverence. It had become more than a weapon. It had become a relic. He would often gaze at it in silence, remembering the moment it pierced Jesus' side, the feel of it in his hands, the sudden weightlessness that followed the wound, the blood, the water, the healing. He could still see the droplets that had touched his skin. He could still feel how they burned and soothed all at once. For most of his life, Longinus had seen his spear as a means to end things, to force surrender, to execute justice. But now, that same instrument had become the symbol of something entirely opposite: a beginning, a birth of mercy in the heart of a soldier. He tried to write about it. He tried to speak of it, but no words ever felt enough. How could he explain that the blood of a dying man had given him sight, not just in his eyes, but in his soul? One evening, he visited the site of the crucifixion again. Golgotha stood the same barren, wind-blown, somber. But for Longinus, it had become holy ground. He stood at the spot where the cross had been raised. He remembered the cries of the crowd, the eerie darkness, the tremors beneath his feet. He knelt and pressed his fingers into the dirt, hoping to feel even a trace of that moment again. And he did, not in thunder or miracles, but in a stillness that entered him like breath. "You died here," he whispered, looking skyward, "and I who helped kill you was healed here." It was not guilt that gripped him anymore. It was awe. In the weeks that followed, Longinus made a quiet but final decision. He resigned from the Roman army. He turned in his armor, left his post, and walked away from everything the empire had ever given him: rank, salary, protection, even honor. To many, it seemed madness. To him, it was freedom. He couldn't be a soldier for Caesar and a follower of Christ at the same time. One demanded obedience through power, the other invited surrender through love. And Longinus had tasted both. His resignation didn't go unnoticed. Among Roman officials, whispers began, the centurion had gone mad. Some said he was bewitched by the Jews. Others believed his mind was broken by battle fatigue. No one could understand the truth because no one else had seen what he had seen. He left Jerusalem behind and traveled into the countryside, following rumors of the disciples. Word of Jesus' resurrection had begun to spread. The empty tomb was now a source of conflict and wonder, suspicion and hope. But Longinus wasn't looking for answers. He was looking for direction. He found it one day when he met Peter again, this time not in hiding, but in a gathering of believers. "You came," Peter said, smiling. "I had nowhere else to go." Longinus replied, "And everywhere else feels like a lie." Peter nodded. He had seen that same look in his own eyes, in the mirror of shame after denying Christ 3 times. And now he saw it in Longinus, a man undone, but not destroyed. They welcomed him into the fledgling community. He joined them in prayer, listened to the stories, shared meals with the widows, cared for the poor. He listened more than he spoke. He had been a man of action all his life, but now he was learning to be a man of faith. Every Sabbath, they gathered to remember Jesus in the breaking of bread and the sharing of wine. When the bread passed to Longinus, his hands shook. He remembered the blood, the wound, the spear. But now that memory became a promise. "This is my body, broken for you." He held the bread as if it were light itself. "This is my blood, poured out for many." He closed his eyes and whispered, "I know." I saw, in time, the disciples began to see something unique in Longinus. He wasn't just a convert. He was a witness, and not just to the crucifixion, but to something deeper. His military discipline, his knowledge of the empire, his command of multiple languages, all of it could now serve a new purpose. "You should return to your homeland," Peter told him one evening as they sat beneath the stars. "There are people there who need to hear what you've seen." Longinus looked away, uncertain. "Cappadocia," Peter continued. "Your homeland. You know its hills, its people, its gods. Tell them about ours." It was not a command. It was a call, and Longinus felt it burn in his chest. He remembered the darkness in his youth, the meaningless rituals, the distant, cold gods. He remembered longing for truth, even when he didn't know that's what he was longing for. And now, he had found it. "I will go," he said. "But not as a soldier," Peter smiled. "As a messenger." "No," Longinus corrected gently. "As a man healed by mercy." Before he departed, the community gathered around him. They prayed over him. Some wept. Others simply laid their hands on his shoulders. He felt their strength, their faith, their love. He carried little with him, just the clothes on his back, a few loaves of bread, a water skin, and a wrapped bundle containing the spearhead. Not to use, but to remember. As he walked the road out of Jerusalem, dust rising behind his heels, Longinus turned back once and gazed toward the city. Somewhere within its walls lay a hill where a cross once stood. Somewhere in its streets walked those who still feared, still doubted, still ran from grace. But Longinus no longer feared. He no longer doubted. He no longer ran. He had pierced the heart of Jesus, and Jesus had pierced his in return. Now, he would carry that wound of love wherever he went. Chapter 4. The Fire Within. Cappadocia stretched before him like a memory wrapped in dust and olive trees. The hills were the same, the wind familiar, and yet Longinus felt like a stranger in his own homeland. The villages he once passed as a proud centurion now greeted him with suspicion, no longer clad in armor. He was just another wanderer with sunburned skin and eyes that held too many truths. He moved quietly through the towns, speaking to no one at first. He observed. He listened. But as the days went on, a fire began to burn inside him, a fire he could no longer contain. It was the same fire that had lit his soul that day on Golgotha, the same flame that had flickered when the blood and water splashed into his eyes. That fire now demanded to be shared. One morning, in a market crowded with fishermen and farmers, Longinus stood on a large stone at the village square of his childhood. With a voice both steady and unfamiliar to the townspeople, he spoke words they never expected to hear from a former Roman centurion. "I was there," he said, "on the hill they call Golgotha. I watched a man die, but he was no ordinary man. I pierced his side with my own spear, and I saw something I cannot explain. Blood and water flowed from him, and when it touched my face, it healed me. The crowd fell silent. His name was Jesus of Nazareth. He was crucified under Pilate's order, like many others, but unlike any I've ever seen. He forgave us as he died. Some scoffed, others stared. He was the Son of God, Longinus continued, and I was the one who confirmed his death, only to discover that through him, I would find life. The silence grew heavier, not with rejection, but with awe. In the days that followed, people began seeking him out, not for military advice, not for stories of Rome, but to hear about this man, this Jesus who had changed a killer into a messenger of peace. He told them everything about the darkness that covered the land, the earthquake that split the rocks, the way Jesus looked at his executioners not with hatred, but sorrow. He told them of the whisper he'd heard in his own heart after the spear struck true, even you, Longinus, even you are loved. Soon, a small group began to form around him. Fishermen, former soldiers, widows, young men, and curious children. They came to listen, to learn, to pray. There was no church, no altar, just gatherings beneath fig trees and in small homes, where bread was broken and wine was shared. And with each story Longinus told, the flame grew. He baptized the first among them in a river not far from where he had once trained as a boy. As he poured the water over their heads, he remembered the flow from Christ's side, the water that had restored his vision. He repeated the same words he had heard when he was baptized in Jerusalem. You are buried with him in death, and raised with him in new life. It wasn't long before his small gatherings began to draw attention not just from the faithful, but from those threatened by this new message. Pagan priests whispered to Roman officials that the ex-centurion was spreading dangerous ideas. Some accused him of sedition, others of madness. The local governor sent soldiers to question him. You left the army, abandoned your oath, and now speak against the empire. Why? Longinus looked the officer in the eye. Because I found a greater king, one who rules not with fear, but with love. He expected punishment. Instead, the soldier hesitated. I heard of this man, the soldier admitted quietly. They say he healed the sick and rose from the grave. He did, Longinus replied, and he lives still. Miracles began to follow him, not always loud or dramatic, but undeniable. A woman blind from birth regained sight after he prayed with her. A child thought dead from fever stirred awake in his mother's arms. A paralyzed man, carried by his brothers, stood and walked after being blessed. Longinus never claimed credit. It's not me, he told them. It is the one who bled for me. And still, the fire spread. He began to travel through the region, visiting towns he once passed in his youth, not as a soldier of Caesar, but as a messenger of Christ. With every village, the story of the Roman centurion who had pierced Jesus' side and been changed forever grew more legendary. The spearhead, which he still carried carefully wrapped in cloth, was never shown publicly. It remained with him, not as a trophy, but a reminder of his past, of mercy undeserved, of grace given freely. One night, he awoke from a dream. In it, he stood again on Golgotha. The sky was dark, but Jesus was not on the cross. Instead, Christ stood before him, whole and radiant. His eyes pierced through the centurion as they had once before. Why do you carry the spear still? Jesus asked. Longinus fell to his knees. Because I need to remember what I did and what you did for me. Jesus reached out and touched his shoulder. Then remember it with love, not guilt. You are not the man you once were. He woke in tears. From that night on, he no longer feared what others thought. He no longer wondered if he was worthy. He knew he wasn't, and that was the point. Christ had called him anyway. Within a year, there were churches meeting in secret across Cappadocia, simple gatherings of the faithful, filled with joy, prayer, and the teachings of Longinus. He wrote letters to believers, visited the sick, and even began training others to teach, baptize, and carry the word beyond the hills. But he also knew this peace would not last. Rome would not sit idly by forever. The empire feared nothing more than a message it couldn't control. And Longinus, once one of its own, had now become a living contradiction, a Roman soldier turned preacher of a crucified king. He had once carried a spear to enforce Caesar's will. Now, he carried the memory of that same spear as a symbol of redemption. Chapter 5. The mission expands. The early morning sun spilled across the hills of Cappadocia, casting a golden hue over the land that had become Longinus's new battlefield, a battlefield not of blood and conquest, but of souls and truth. The wind carried with it the sound of children laughing, of farmers calling to their oxen, and from one modest home, the sound of quiet prayer and broken bread. Longinus sat among his growing circle of believers, their faces lit with hope, their hands clasped as they prepared to share a meal that was no longer just food. It was remembrance. He had not imagined this life for himself. He was once a man of violence, trained to follow orders, to deliver punishment swiftly and without remorse. But now, each day began and ended with grace. The same spear that once took life had marked the beginning of his own rebirth, and that rebirth was spreading. The small gatherings had grown into communities. People were traveling from distant regions to hear the testimony of the Roman who had seen the Christ. Longinus welcomed them all, Jew, Greek, soldier, servant. He told them the truth, not dressed in eloquence, but raw and real. He didn't need to embellish. His presence, his past, his transformation, these were his sermon. Word eventually reached the apostles in Jerusalem about what was happening in Cappadocia. Peter and John sent a messenger to confirm it. When the young disciple arrived and saw what had taken root there, he wept, not for sorrow, but for awe. Longinus, the man who had once pierced the Savior, had now pierced the hearts of hundreds with the word. The apostolic messenger brought with him two things: a letter from Peter affirming Longinus's mission, and a vial of oil for anointing. "You are not just a witness," the letter said. "You are a shepherd now. The sheep hear your voice not because of who you were, but because of who you are in him." It was that same week Longinus first performed the laying of hands on others for ministry. It felt strange at first. He had once trained men to kill, now he trained them to give life. The first two were a merchant's son and a freed slave. Both had come to the faith after hearing Longinus speak in a dusty courtyard. He taught them the scriptures, baptized them in the river, and prayed over them with the oil sent from Jerusalem. "You are not perfect," he told them. "Neither am I, but the one we follow is. Let his strength be your own." The days became weeks, and the weeks became seasons. And with each passing season, the faith grew stronger and more rooted. They built their first small gathering house out of clay and stone. It was simple, no cross, no icons, no ornaments, but the presence of God dwelled within its walls. But as with all things holy, the darkness soon took notice. Roman officials in Caesarea received word of the gatherings. Reports spoke of a growing sect led by a deserter, a former centurion turned preacher. They were told that this man was undermining loyalty to Caesar, that he spoke of another king, and that people were beginning to refuse sacrifices to the Roman gods. The imperial cult had little tolerance for alternatives. Religion, after all, was not just about belief, it was about control. Longinus received a warning from a sympathetic trader who passed through the region. "They are watching you. They say you dishonor Rome." He nodded. "I serve a higher kingdom now, and the one I follow died dishonored." But the warning wasn't ignored. He gathered his disciples one night in the dim candlelight of the meeting house. The air was heavy, but his voice was calm. "They may come for us. Some of you may be taken. Some of you may be harmed. But do not let fear silence the truth. If they ask you who you follow, speak his name. If they tell you to recant, stand firm. And if they ask who taught you, say it was the man who once held the spear but now holds the cross." He paused, then looked each of them in the eye. "And if they ask where I am, tell them." It wasn't long before the soldiers arrived, but they did not find Longinus in hiding. He was in the village square, speaking to a small crowd about the parable of the prodigal son. As the soldiers approached, the people parted with murmurs of fear. The lead officer looked stunned when he saw him. "Centurion," he asked, more confused than commanding. "I was," Longinus said gently. "Now I'm just a servant." The officer hesitated. "You're under arrest for desertion and for leading an illegal sect." Longinus raised his hands. "Then I will go with you, but I will not be silent." The villagers watched in stunned silence as the man they had come to know and love as a leader, healer, and teacher walked away in chains. But he did not lower his head, and he did not stop speaking. He spoke to the soldiers on the road. He spoke to the guards in the holding cells. He spoke even when beaten, and in every word, he pointed not to himself, but to the one who had changed everything. The trial, if it could be called that, was brief. The Roman magistrate read the charges: abandonment of military duty, inciting rebellion through religion, refusing sacrifice to the emperor. Longinus did not deny any of it. Is it true? The magistrate asked, that you proclaim loyalty to a crucified man over Caesar? Yes, Longinus said, because Caesar may rule this world, but Jesus reigns over eternity. The court gasped. The magistrate ordered silence, but Longinus's voice carried. He died by my hand and rose again despite it. He forgave me. What loyalty could I ever give another? The sentence was exile, but it would not last. From the underground cells where he was kept, Longinus continued to speak. Converts were made among the guards. Prisoners began to pray. Some even fasted. The spearhead he had once carried was now hidden in a crack in the stone wall. Beside him his reminder of mercy, buried in darkness with him. But he knew the truth. Even here, the fire burned. He was not afraid. He was not alone. And his mission had only just begun. Chapter 6, the hour of signs. Longinus had once known the sound of marching boots and shouted commands echoing through Roman streets. But now, from the shadows of a dank prison cell, it was a different kind of rhythm that filled his ears. The whispered prayers of believers, the soft shuffle of sandals as guards quietly entered not to scorn but to listen. Something unexplainable had begun to stir within those stone walls. At first, only 1 or 2 guards lingered after delivering meals. They pretended to tidy or inspect, but in truth, they stayed to hear Longinus speak. He didn't preach like the philosophers they'd heard in Roman courts. He spoke like a man wounded, a man healed. His voice was calm, but his words carried the weight of blood and redemption. One night, a young jailer named Marius approached with trembling hands. "Is it true?" he asked. "Did you really see him rise?" Longinus looked into the boy's wide eyes. "I saw the tomb. I saw the guards who fled in terror. I saw the stone rolled away. And I saw him alive, radiant, not as a ghost, but flesh and glory." "Why didn't you run?" Marius asked. "Because I finally had someone worth following." From that night on, Marius never left his side. And he wasn't alone. Other soldiers began requesting assignment to the prison, not to suppress, but to witness. They carried questions in their hearts and left with something like peace, something that had never come from gods carved in stone. Rumors spread beyond the prison. Miracles, they said. Healing, even within those dark corridors. A prisoner who had not walked in years stood and stretched his legs like a child awakening from sleep. A woman condemned for theft was overcome with a sudden, searing vision of her family and collapsed in tears of repentance. The rumors grew legs and walked the city. And then came the governor's daughter. She had been blind since childhood, born with clouded eyes. No healer had helped her, no offering to Roman gods had reversed it. But she had heard of the soldier in the prison, the one who had seen the blood and water, and claimed to have been healed by them. She came not as royalty, but cloaked and barefoot. Her father would have forbidden it. The moment she entered the cell, Longinus's breath caught, not at her appearance, but at the conviction that stirred in his heart. He had not sought a sign. He had not asked for miracles. But here was a girl born into darkness, walking toward a man who once brought death and now carried life. "I don't want a story," she said. "I want to see." Longinus stood and asked her to kneel. He reached for the cloth wrapped in the crevice of the wall, the cloth that had held the tip of his spear. He had not touched it in weeks. Gently, he brushed it over her eyes, not as magic, but as memory. "Jesus," he whispered, "you opened my eyes once, not just to see but to believe. Do it again. For her, for your glory." A silence fell. Then a gasp. She opened her eyes and stared at him. "I see your face," she said, a tear falling. Marius fell to his knees. The other prisoners began to weep. One guard dropped his sword and made the sign of the cross, the gesture he'd learned in secret from Longinus. The girl's healing spread across the city faster than any decree from the Senate. Her father, red with rage at first, grew pale with awe when she walked through the palace gates and looked him in the eye. It wasn't the soldier, she told him. It was the one he follows. Longinus's cell was no longer a prison. It became a sanctuary. The city tried to hide what was happening, but it was too late. The miracles could not be silenced. The truth could not be chained. The governor, under pressure from Rome, had Longinus transferred in the dead of night to a more secure location. They hoped it would slow the spread. Instead, it spread faster. The guards who escorted him were among the first to convert during the journey. They returned to Cappadocia with stories of a man who spoke of love even while chained. He said Christ went to the cross with peace. One of them told his family, "If that's weakness, then I've never seen such strength." And so, Longinus was moved from prison to prison across the provinces. Each one became a birthplace of faith. In Ephesus, a crippled boy walked. In Pergamon, a man known for violence gave up his sword and wept. In Tarsus, a woman who had not spoken in 5 years sang a psalm in the darkness. Everywhere he went, Longinus carried to things the memory of the man he had pierced, and the joy of being pierced by that man's mercy. One night, in the prison near Antioch, he was visited by an old man dressed like a merchant, but with the eyes of someone who had seen too much. "You're the one they call the spear-bearer?" the man asked. Longinus nodded. "That was once my title." The man smiled. "I'm one of the 70 sent out by the Lord. I saw him heal. I saw him risen. And I've heard of you from the apostles in Jerusalem. They send their blessing." The old man laid a hand on Longinus's shoulder. "They say the gospel has reached Rome and Africa, even the edge of Gaul. But I tell you now, what you've done in the prisons is no less powerful." Longinus lowered his head. "I am not worthy." The old man laughed softly. "Neither were we. That's the beauty of it." The fire within him did not fade. But Longinus knew the time was drawing near. There were whispers again, this time of a formal sentence. He would not be shuffled from prison to prison any longer. The empire had grown weary of the miracles, of the conversions, of the joy that kept blooming wherever he was sent. One morning, the door of his cell opened and a magistrate stepped in. "By order of the emperor, you are to be executed at dawn." Longinus smiled. "Finally," he said, "I get to go home." Chapter 7. Trial by Fire. The prison was silent before dawn. Not with the kind of silence that warns of danger, but the solemn stillness of a soul, already in communion with eternity. Longinus had not slept. He didn't need to. Sleep was for the weary, but his spirit soared with the peace of one who had completed the mission set before him. The guard who brought his final meal couldn't meet his eyes. He set down the bread and water with trembling hands, his mouth opening and closing like a man struggling to breathe under the weight of guilt. "Speak," Longinus said gently. I asked to be reassigned. I didn't want to be the one to." He looked away. "But they denied me. I'm under order." Longinus placed a hand on his shoulder. "Do not be afraid of those who kill the body," he said. "You are not my executioner. You are my escort." "To what?" "To home." The young guard's eyes filled with tears. "Is there any hope for a man who spent his life following cruel orders?" "There was hope for me," Longinus said, "even as I held the spear." The guard fell to his knees. Just before sunrise, Longinus was led out into the open courtyard of the military outpost. The execution was to be swift and public. Officials had arranged for a handful of citizens and soldiers to witness it, hoping to snuff out the growing fire of faith in the region. He stood tall in his chains, not as a criminal, but as a man prepared to be reunited with his king. Longinus of Cappadocia, the magistrate called out, former centurion of the Roman army, accused of desertion, blasphemy against the state, and inciting civil unrest through the propagation of a forbidden religion. "Do you deny these charges?" "I deny nothing," Longinus answered clearly. "But the truth is far greater than your charges." The magistrate grimaced. "Then you will die with the name of your crucified king on your lips." Longinus smiled. "And rise again with his name in my heart." He knelt without being told. He lowered his head, not in shame, but in reverence. The crowd was silent. The executioner raised his sword. But before the blade fell, Longinus spoke one last time. "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." The blade came down. What happened next would become legend. As Longinus's head touched the ground, several witnesses swore they heard it speak softly, but clearly, Jesus, and from the open wound on his neck, not only blood flowed but milk, white, pure, unexplainable. It soaked into the earth as if heaven itself had left a final signature on his sacrifice. The crowd gasped. One woman fainted. A soldier dropped his shield. But it was the executioner who broke first. He had once marched under Longinus's command. He had never questioned orders, never flinched at death. But now, looking at the man he had just slain, he felt something snap within him. He turned to the magistrate, tears streaking his face. "I will no longer serve Caesar," he said. "I will serve the one this man died for." Then he dropped his sword and walked away unarmed, unashamed, and unafraid. The believers of Cappadocia, many of whom had remained hidden for fear of arrest, came out that very night, under cover of darkness. They retrieved Longinus's body and buried him with honor and reverence. They marked the place not with a monument of marble, but with the sign of the cross etched in stone. It became a place of pilgrimage. People came not because he was a soldier, nor because he had once pierced Christ, but because he had allowed himself to be pierced by truth and had never turned back. In the years that followed, many would visit his grave and report miracles of healed limbs, restored sight, and peace in the hearts of the hopeless. But perhaps the greatest miracle was this, that a man, trained for violence, had become a vessel of mercy, that one who had once enforced fear now taught love, that a Roman centurion had become a Christian martyr. When word reached the apostles in Jerusalem, they wept not in grief, but in awe. "He who pierced him," Peter whispered, "has now become like him." They declared a day of remembrance for Longinus, the centurion turned saint, and when letters were written to the churches, his name was whispered with reverence. His story shared as a testimony of transformation. From Judea to Antioch, from Alexandria to Rome, the name Longinus became a beacon of hope for all who thought they were too far gone to be saved. If a soldier could be changed by grace, then anyone could. And Longinus, now Saint Longinus, continued his mission from beyond the grave, not by sword or decree, but by prayer, by miracle, and by the quiet voice that echoed in the hearts of all who heard his story. Truly, this man was the Son of God. Chapter 8. The fire that spread. Longinus may have fallen by the sword, but his death was not an end, it was a beginning. His martyrdom struck a chord deep in the hearts of believers across Cappadocia and beyond. The execution designed to silence him only gave power to his message. Whispers of his final moments, of the name he spoke, the miracle that followed, and the unshakable peace he carried spread faster than Roman edicts. In the weeks that followed his death, the tomb of Longinus became a gathering place. First came the poor, those who had listened to his teachings from alleyways and kitchens. Then came the sick, hoping for healing. And then, astonishingly, came soldiers. Hardened men who had once laughed at the name of Jesus now stood in silence beside the grave of the man who had first made them wonder if they'd been wrong. They weren't wrong to wonder. Miracles began to happen. They weren't grand and theatrical, but they were real. A blind woman claimed she could see again after kneeling where his blood had touched the earth. A child born mute whispered the name Jesus for the first time after her mother prayed at his tomb. And there were others more than the magistrates could hide. Roman officials tried to suppress the devotion. They outlawed visits to the site. They posted guards. They issued punishments for those caught praying at his grave. But it only made the people braver. Men and women crept in under the cover of night, knelt in silence, and left with joy in their eyes. It was in this hidden devotion that something deeper was born. The idea that the faith Longinus died for was worth living for. From this small movement came a wave of conversions. Young men began to gather to read the letters of the apostles. Women formed prayer circles and shared the teachings Longinus had passed on. The community, once timid and underground, now had a martyr, someone whose blood had joined the blood of the Christ he followed. It gave them courage, it gave them voice, and soon, it gave them purpose. One of the young converts, a former soldier named Julian, took up the work where Longinus had left off. Julian had once served with Longinus, admired his discipline, and now found himself drawn to the same calling. He had heard Longinus speak in prison, had witnessed the fire in his words, and had seen the miracle when Longinus healed a child by simply praying over her. Julian began traveling from village to village, sharing the story of the man who pierced Christ and was transformed. He carried nothing but a small wooden cross and a sliver of cloth said to have been touched by Longinus's blood. But wherever he went, people listened, not because Julian was eloquent, but because Longinus had made the faith real. Word of Longinus's posthumous miracles eventually reached Jerusalem, and from there, Rome. Bishops and early church leaders began to include his name in prayers. They considered his transformation one of the clearest signs of God's mercy, a man of the sword, becoming a servant of grace. Churches began springing up in his name. A small chapel was built in Cappadocia over his burial site, humble, made of clay and stone. But to those who gathered there, it was holier than any marble temple. They sang songs of hope and recounted the passion of the Christ not just through scripture, but through Longinus's story. They remembered how a soldier with failing vision was given sight not just in his eyes, but in his soul. And they taught their children that true strength is not found in armor, but in surrender. In one distant province, a young boy named Lucian heard the story of Longinus for the first time. His father was a merchant, his mother a seamstress, and neither had spoken openly of Christ in fear of Roman retaliation. But something about the tale struck Lucian's heart. He didn't understand all the theology, but he understood this. A man who had once been feared became loved. A soldier who had caused death now brought life. And Lucian, barely 12, made a vow, "I will serve the same king." Years later, Lucian would become a priest. He would carry the message of Longinus to foreign lands, and when asked about his calling, he would say, "It started at a grave." With a whisper, what the Romans failed to realize was this: martyrdom never ends a message, it amplifies it. And Longinus, the centurion who had once served Caesar, became a symbol for all those who wrestled with their past, for soldiers ashamed of the blood on their hands, for pagans tired of hollow rituals, for anyone who had stared into darkness and longed for light. He became their patron, not because he was perfect, but because he was changed over time. Artists began to paint his likeness. In every depiction, Longinus held a spear, but not as a weapon. It pointed not outward, but upward, toward the heavens, a tool of death transformed into a symbol of redemption. His story was carved into the walls of monasteries. His name was spoken in whispered prayers across deserts, rivers, and coasts. And even as empires rose and fell, Longinus stood unshaken in memory, a permanent reminder that no soul is too far for grace to reach, no spear too sharp to be surrendered, no past too heavy to be redeemed. And so the fire spread not in revolt, but in revelation, the faith of a centurion, the mercy of a savior, and the miracle of a man who opened the side of Christ, only to find his own heart opened in return. Chapter 9, The Final Witness. Longinus's name had spread far beyond the boundaries of Cappadocia. By the time the third year after his martyrdom approached, his story was no longer a whispered tale among the faithful. It was a bold anthem of transformation, courage, and grace. Converts carried it with them on their journeys. Priests read it during secret masses. Children recited it beside candlelit shrines. To believe in Christ was to know Longinus. This growing reverence did not go unnoticed. In Rome, the imperial advisors kept detailed records of all social disturbances, and the name Longinus appeared with troubling frequency. They had thought that executing him would be enough to bury his influence. Instead, it had made him more powerful than ever dead, yet speaking through every person whose life had been changed by his testimony. Under Nero's reign, persecution of Christians reached a new fever pitch. The emperor, known for his cruelty and desire for control, demanded order and allegiance. Stories of a former Roman centurion turned martyr stirred not admiration, but fear among his commanders. If a man like Longinus could abandon his post and sway entire villages with his words, what other soldiers might follow? If the people began to believe in this Jesus not as a defeated criminal, but as a risen king, what would happen to Rome's authority? And so, the order came. The name of Longinus was to be erased, his tomb dismantled, his followers punished. Anyone found invoking his name would be treated as a traitor to the empire. But there was one thing the empire could never seem to do: erase the faith of those it tried to silence. Julian, now older and more seasoned in ministry, had returned to Cappadocia when word reached him of Rome's intentions. The chapel built over Longinus's tomb had already been desecrated, the simple stone cross shattered. Guards patrolled the area day and night. Still, Julian came, not to fight, but to remember. On a quiet morning, he knelt at the ruins of the chapel. In his hands, he held a scroll of parchment, an account he had written of Longinus's life, death, and the miracles that followed. He buried it beneath the stones, praying that one day it would be found. "Let those in the future know," he whispered, "that light once shone here, and that even if it was buried, it will rise again." In another part of the province, an elderly widow named Thalia prepared to leave for Antioch. She had spent the last decade quietly tending to the sick, never forgetting the man who had once placed his hand on her shoulder and told her, "Even the weary will be lifted." That man was Longinus. She had met him only once, during a gathering of new believers, when her body was frail and her spirit weaker still. His words had given her strength. His story had given her hope. Now, as Rome threatened to stamp out everything he had inspired, she could not remain still. She carried with her a relic, a scrap of cloth believed to have been stained with the blood that flowed from Longinus's neck. Wrapped in linen and placed close to her heart, she guarded it as others might guard gold. Her plan was simple: bring it to a growing Christian community in Antioch, where it could be protected and venerated. But the journey would be long, and Thalia knew her time was limited. So she walked slowly, blessing each village she passed, sharing stories of the man who had once pierced Christ and then been pierced by love. And in each place, something stirred. Though the empire sought to destroy all traces of Longinus, it was too late. His memory had already entered the bloodstream of the church. His story had been carved into hearts, not walls. And so, when officials raided homes and demanded denials, many stood firm. A fisherman from Pontus, when asked to step on an image of the cross, replied, "The man who nailed him knew he was God, and I know no less." A baker in Tarsus was caught praying for healing beside a shrine made of broken pottery. When soldiers tried to mock her, she said, "I kneel where Longinus knelt." That is enough. The faith that Longinus had nurtured was no longer confined to geography. It had become part of a movement, quiet, resilient, and unstoppable. One of the most striking events during this period of suppression involved a Roman commander named Severinus, a man of strict discipline and unquestioning loyalty. Severinus had personally led raids on Christian homes and imprisoned dozens of believers. But on one occasion, his path crossed with that of a young girl named Lydia, who had been caring for her paralyzed brother. Severinus questioned her harshly. "Where is your God? Why doesn't he heal him?" Lydia answered without fear, "He already did through St. Longinus. He showed us that even death cannot stop love." Severinus laughed at first, but something in her eyes, something reminiscent of stories he had once dismissed, stayed with him. That night, he could not sleep. The next day, he returned to the house alone and found Lydia still there, praying silently. "What did you mean?" he asked, "when you said death cannot stop love?" She looked up at him, calm and confident, "Because Longinus is with Christ now, and Christ is with us." Severinus left without a word. Weeks later, he disappeared from service. Some say he fled to the mountains. Others say he was seen praying at the remains of Longinus's chapel. Wherever he went, his absence marked a small crack in the Roman commander's seat of doubt, perhaps even faith. The church never forgot Longinus. The places he walked, the people he blessed, the wounds he bore, they were remembered in stories passed down through generations. Though the original chapel was lost, a new one would one day rise on that same soil, built by believers who had grown from the seeds he had planted. In time, his name would be spoken during liturgies, his image painted on cathedral walls, his relics carried across oceans. But none of it would mean more than this simple truth: Longinus believed, and he gave his life to prove it, not as a soldier of empire but as a soldier of grace. His final witness was not the drop of blood on the spear, nor the milk that poured from his wound, but the enduring fire he lit in the hearts of those who heard him speak the name above every name, Jesus. Chapter 10, Legacy in the Light. Longinus had died. Decades ago, the empire that once condemned him still stood, mighty and loud. But its grip was weakening not through war, not by rebellion, but through the gentle force of a faith that refused to die. And in the heart of this faith was the story of a soldier who once served Caesar and now served Christ. By now, Christians in far corners of the world had heard the tale. In Gaul, children played out the moment the centurion raised his spear, then covered their eyes and cried out, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." In Alexandria, believers whispered his name before lighting candles. In Jerusalem, his presence lingered felt in the shadows of Golgotha, where it all began. The church, now stronger and more organized, began collecting the stories of its saints. Bishops, scribes, and theologians gathered accounts, relics, and letters. And in their records, the name Longinus appeared again and again, not as a legend, but as a witness. A man who did not simply believe, but who saw, who stood beneath the cross and declared what others could not, that the broken man hanging between criminals was, in truth, the King of Heaven. It was this bold confession made not in triumph, but in awe that the church preserved. And it was this confession that people clung to in moments of fear, sickness, and doubt. A basilica rose in Cappadocia, not grand in size, but deep in spirit. Pilgrims came from across the Roman world, not to see gold or marble, but to kneel on the earth where Longinus had fallen. The basilica held no royal treasures, only his simple cloak, stained with the dust of his last journey, and a piece of wood believed to be from the cross he stood beside. Beneath the altar, his remains were buried, and around them, the faithful gathered, sick and healthy, young and old. Roman and foreign, drawn not by spectacle, but by hope. One morning, during a vigil service, a mother came with her daughter, a child who had lost her sight after a fever. She said nothing as she entered the sanctuary, only knelt and wept silently. Pressing the child's hand against the stone floor, the priest, seeing her pain, approached with a relic, a shard from the spear, believed to be the one Longinus had held. He did not promise miracles. He did not speak loudly. He only whispered, "May you see," with the faith he found. The child blinked, then again, and gasped. "I see," she said, her voice thin but full of wonder. Word spread. As always, Longinus had healed not through power, but through presence, not by magic, but by grace. It was during this time that artisans began to sculpt his image, always in Roman armor, always with a spear, but with eyes lifted to heaven. One hand clutched the weapon that had pierced the Lord, the other rested gently on his chest, over the heart that had been broken and made whole. In these sculptures, he was not a warrior, but a witness, not a conqueror, but a convert. And wherever his image stood, people remembered, no one is beyond mercy. Over the centuries, kings and emperors would claim the spear of Longinus as a relic of power. Charlemagne held it. Frederick Barbarossa carried it into battle. Napoleon searched for it. And while armies saw it as a symbol of victory, the church never forgot its true meaning. It was not the spear that had power, it was the blood it touched, and the man it changed. In time, Longinus came to be known by another title, the patron of the lost. It began humbly. A farmer in Hispania lost a family heirloom and prayed to the saint, who had once been lost in violence and found himself in Christ. He found the heirloom the next morning. A traveler in the mountains of Thrace lost his way and lit a candle before a roadside statue of Longinus. He was guided to safety by a monk hours later. Soon, stories piled up. Missing keys, lost letters, faded memories, each found again after a prayer to the centurion who found the light. The church, recognizing this devotion, embraced it not as superstition, but as spiritual insight. After all, who better to help the lost than the one who once stood in darkness and was given sight? And so the devotion grew. In Latin America, statues of Longinus stood in homes and churches. Children learned to say his name when they misplaced something. Candles were lit, prayers were whispered. Some even jumped 3 times while calling on him, a joyful ritual, meant to mirror the hope of recovery. But behind all these traditions was a deeper truth. Longinus helped people find more than lost objects. He helped them find faith again, hope again, God again. Every Good Friday, at churches around the world, the Passion is read old. As Christ's body hangs on the cross, a voice reads aloud the moment the centurion speaks. Truly, this man was the Son of God. In that moment, silence fills the room, because everyone knows who that centurion was, and everyone knows what came after. At St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, under Michelangelo's dome, stands a statue by Bernini Longinus, larger than life, holding his spear, eyes wide, heart open. Tourists pass it every day, snapping pictures, admiring the artistry. Some stop, fewer kneel. But for those who know the story, that sculpture is not marble, it is memory. It is a testimony carved in stone that even the fiercest warrior can be remade in love. Even the blindest man can be made to see. Even the most lost can be found. And even the one who pierced Christ can one day be pierced by Christ. Longinus did not die a hero. He died redeemed. And in his redemption, we are reminded that the greatest miracle is not healing, it's transformation.